Now we're going to take a look at these social issues that have shaped and defined um, the 20th century. Now, one of the big ones, or two of the big ones, are going to be in religion. One is fundamentalism, and one is kind of a new liberalism or kind of a reformation that's happened in the religions. Both of these are a response to the modern world that has developed very quickly and rapidly and has begun to challenge those religions. In fundamentalism, their response is to attack modernity and push against it, and this happens in every major religion, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism. All of them have, in some ways, shape, or form, a fundamentalist perspective in one of their branches. In Christianity, we have the evangelicals. In Islam, it's the Salafism, which branched off of the Wahhabism. And in both of these, there's going to be a very literal interpretation of their holy book. So in Christianity, it's the Bible. In Islam, it's the Quran. And this will lead them to um, make new determinations, whether it's a stricter Sharia law that's put in place or whether it's fighting against new scientific discoveries like evolution and other movements like that. And so in Christianity, this will lead to maybe a slightly more peaceful setting of evangelicals getting more involved in politics and trying to change how things are viewed and how the modern world is working through that. Although there is violence in some and there's terrible protests that happen, like we might see with the Westboro Baptist Church. However, it's not as maybe violent as we might see with the Salafist groups that develop out of the movement because they set up terrorist groups. You have groups like Al Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS, and all these groups, and this movement is calling for fatwas or wars against other people, and then the jihad where you have people actually go and fight for those. Now, if you remember, if we talk with more moderate Muslims, jihad is not going to mean a fight with other people. Instead, it's an internal struggle with the things, the demons that you fight. In this case, though, it's a fight with the demons outside your body, other groups of people. So the West, primarily the U.S. and European powers that once controlled the Middle East, is their main fight in this jihad. But as I said, not all religions, or not everyone in religion goes to this. Instead, some will kind of reform, and especially we see this in the church with the idea of liberal Christianity, which brings in some new ideas and becomes more accepting of others, whether it's other religions, whether it's groups of people, as we can see now with in the U.S. Christians are, some Christian or branches of Christianity are bringing in the homosexual community and allowing them to marry in their churches and pushing for that kind of equality. And so we can see this in movements such as Vatican II, which modernized the Catholic Church and led to more participation of non-clergy members and Mass being preached in vernacular or the native tongue of the peoples instead of it having to be in Latin. And they've really, the Catholic Church has kind of maybe started to reform a little bit more or fought more for social justice issues, which is a big idea in liberal Christianity, with the new Pope and Pope Francis, who's really stepped up to try to fight to help those communities. Now, we don't just have changes in religions, but we also have changes in human rights. And we took a look at the Declaration of the Human Rights, and this is kind of a new idea for this time period that everyone has these rights, and those rights cannot be taken away. And we see this start off with the Nuremberg trials that began in 1945 after World War II, and Nazi leaders are put on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity in the terrible things they did during the Holocaust and ways they fought the war. And so the defendants were charged for violating those rights, and if they violated them, then they were guilty and they faced the death penalty or years in prison, whatever the punishment that was doled out by the judges would be. And all these ideas of rights are kind of a throwback back to the Enlightenment. And if we talk about the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the Enlightenment thinkers, all of this kind of stems from them. And this then led to the creation of those 30 rights we took a look at. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was done by the UN in 1948. And so you have things like the freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Everyone has those. Those should never be taken away. You should always have liberty and property and personal security and freedom to move if you want to move, right to fair trials. All those things are things that you should have because you are a human being, not because you're a specific person, not because you're rich, because you're poor, because you're white, because you're black, because you're Asian. Whatever your nationality is, doesn't matter. You have those, and they shouldn't be taken away. However, if you remember, the UN doesn't necessarily have the power to enforce this type of thing, even if countries sign on to it, unless the Security Council says this is global law or this is what all the countries of the world are going to fight for. It doesn't have a way to really enforce those ideas. And so, although countries have signed on for it, it hasn't necessarily happened. Like we can see in Russia, there's not necessarily freedom of speech and religion. Well, freedom of religion, but not necessarily freedom of speech or liberty, or really actually being able to have fair trials or being able to vote in the country. Although you can vote, it's kind of been rigged maybe the last few times by Vladimir Putin. And we can also talk about China and the abuses that have happened there. We could spend hours and hours on that, but we'll move on. And that not all the countries, even though they've signed it, mandated it. And even the U.S. you could look at, and throughout our history, didn't necessarily do that. But these rights have led to new movements throughout the world. One of the major ones was the civil rights movement in the U.S., where African Americans stood up to fight for their full rights that were promised in the Constitution and also promised by the United Nations. And so if you remember from other history classes, or you just remember overall, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the one that leads this movement. You have other figures like Malcolm X who are in there trying to fight for this as well. But for the most part, Martin Luther King Jr. is the major figurehead, and he sets up these peaceful protests throughout all the United States, or really the South, to fight for that equality. And all this was influenced by the earlier peaceful protester Gandhi with the Indian independence movement. And this movement then leads to calls for civil rights in other nations, especially in South Africa where there's apartheid, and they will follow a similar message to what Martin Luther King did and what Gandhi did. Now, also during this time period, in the 50s and 60s, along with the civil rights movement, we have the rise of feminism again. And feminism is kind of the idea that men and women are equal, or should be seen as equal to each other, especially in the West. This is the main view. So if we talk about the United States and Europe, it is a fight for men and women to be equal to each other, so that there should be equal pay, and women should only get paid 78% of the amount that men get paid. Women should have a right to property. They should have a right to an education that's equal to men. They should be able to seek out birth control if they want to have birth control, whether that's abortion or pills or whatever it may be. So in the West, it's a fight to make men or make women equal to men. While it's actually a little bit different in developing nations, because their communities might be a little bit closer knit, and there is some fight for women to have the equality, but they're more looking for better food supply, better protection, better wages overall, to help bring them out of the situations they're in. And they want to do it for the whole family and for the community. It's not just individual women that will rise up out of that. And so feminism will carry on. It's still going on today, but it was a major push definitely then, and it did a lot of good if we talk about the West and what's happened in the U.S. and that even though women today only get paid 78% of what men get, that is a huge jump from what it was before. And ladies, you have rights to have your own credit card, and not that your husband is the only one that has it in the 1950s, and that you can own property, and that you can inherit what your husband had, that you can ask for a divorce. And so it's getting better. It's not perfect, but the other thing to remember is we're fighting millennias of patriarchal culture, and so it's not going to be something that just disappears overnight. But it is a continued fight, and it will continue as we keep going forward. So We can see, as we just talked about, women's rights are still being fought for. In the West, they're still happening, but even more so in other countries, in developing countries where they're fighting for that larger community, or they're fighting to have equal rights to what women in the West have. In some Muslim countries that are very fundamentalist, if we talk about like Saudi Arabia, Iran, women want to be more equal to what happens in the West. Now, not all of them do, but they at least want more rights, the right to vote, the right to a equal education. Some do want the rights to be able to wear whatever they want and speak whatever they want and have all those rights, but that's not necessarily a goal for everyone. Also, some other violations that are happening as we looked at genocides, and you have Rwanda, Darfur. Is ISIS committing genocide right now, or is it just mass killings of people in general? But we have those things going on just because people look different, have a different religion they follow, have a different ethnicity, whatever it may be. And you have some other violations such as child soldiers in Africa. If we talk about paramilitaries fighting against the government or fighting to control diamonds and other resources in the country, you have soldiers at the age of 10, 12, 9, 13, 14, 15, 16, whatever it is, are carrying guns around and fighting wars for generals. And these are just a couple of the violations that are going on. I mean, we still have slavery. There are still other issues out there. But these are just some of the major issues that are still going on today, even though we've been fighting for these human rights. And so it might seem overwhelming that there are all these things that we fought for, and they haven't been fixed. But one thing we have to remember is things take a while to change. Usually there aren't just drastic changes that happen overnight. And second thing is there are groups working to bring about these changes, to help fix these social issues. You have the Red Cross and the Red Crescent working to bring humanitarian aid to these peoples that are in trouble, that are in refugee camps, fleeing the conflicts with groups like ISIS, or that were fleeing Darfur and fleeing Rwanda when the genocide was going on there. You have Amnesty International, which raises the awareness of political prisoners and fights to end slavery, and they're going about doing all that in the countries. You have the World Health Organization working to lessen the impact of diseases on people and to spread vaccines and news about health, how to stop and prevent AIDS and Ebola and things like that. They are fighting to do that, to uplift and bring up the lives of everyone. And then you have UNICEF, which works to protect children's rights and to help them survive. So again, more aid for those that are refugees or those that are not getting the proper supplements that they need. So all this is going on in this global age to try to raise up the level of developing countries or those people that are struggling. It's still not perfect, but it is a step in the right direction, and it's a way that if you want to get involved to fix some of these things that are going on in this world, these give you an opportunity if you're in this developed nation or in a developed nation to participate in that. And it's a way you can fight for the human rights of others and not just your own.